September 1st, 1939. Dawn breaks over the Polish frontier, and with it comes a sound that will define the next 6 years of human history. It is not the crack of a single rifle or the bark of artillery, but a symphony of mechanized violence. The roar of panzer engines, the whistle of Stuka dive bombers, the rhythmic thump of jackboots on cobblestone roads. For the German soldiers crossing into Poland that morning, the war begins not with dread, but with exhilaration. They are young, most of them, born into the chaos of the Weimar Republic, raised on promises of national redemption, trained to believe that Germany's humiliation at Versailles was a temporary injustice soon to be rectified. The propaganda films they watched in darkened theaters showed them a future of glory, a Reich that would last 1,000 years, built on the strength of German steel and the will of the German people. They expected resistance, certainly. The Poles would fight, as any nation would. But they also expected victory, swift and total, the kind of victory that would erase 20 years of shame in a matter of weeks. What they could not expect, what no amount of training or indoctrination could prepare them for, was the long descent that would follow. The transformation from conquerors to condemned, from the masters of Europe to the rubble and ruin of Berlin in 1945. To understand the Second World War through German eyes is to witness not merely a military defeat, but a civilizational collapse, the unraveling of certainties, the bitter discovery that ideology cannot stop artillery shells, that willpower cannot substitute for resources, that the promise of invincibility is the cruelest lie a nation can tell its sons. The origins of German confidence in 1939 were not irrational. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, had stripped Germany of territory, imposed crippling reparations, and demanded acceptance of sole responsibility for the First World War. The treaty was not merely punitive, it was humiliating, designed to prevent Germany from ever again threatening European stability. But it failed to achieve lasting peace. Instead, it planted the seeds of resentment that Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party cultivated with ruthless efficiency. Hitler promised restoration, of territory, of pride, of Germany's rightful place among the great powers. And for 6 years before the invasion of Poland, he delivered. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, the absorption of Czechoslovakia, each was accomplished without firing a shot. Each proved that Britain and France would not risk war to enforce the Versailles Settlement. By September 1939, the German military was a formidable instrument. The Wehrmacht combined traditional Prussian discipline with innovations in mechanized warfare that other European armies had failed to adopt. The concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, emphasized speed, coordination between tanks and aircraft, the penetration of enemy lines followed by rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. It was not merely a tactic, but a philosophy, rooted in the understanding that modern war rewarded aggression, that hesitation was fatal, that the side which struck first and fastest held the advantage. The Polish campaign seemed to confirm this philosophy. Warsaw fell in 27 days. The Polish army, brave but outmatched, could not withstand the combination of panzer columns and Luftwaffe bombardment. German casualties were relatively light, 16,000 dead, a fraction of the losses sustained in a single day during the battles of the First World War. For the soldiers who participated, Poland was validation. They had been told they were superior, and the evidence seemed irrefutable. The propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, ensured that the German public received constant reinforcement of this narrative. Newsreels showed triumphant troops, captured Polish equipment, civilians greeting German soldiers with flowers. The message was clear. Germany was on the march, and nothing could stop it. The spring of 1940 brought even greater triumphs. The invasion of France, launched on May 10th, shattered the myth of French military power. The Maginot Line, that elaborate system of fortifications along the Franco-German border, was bypassed through Belgium and the Ardennes forest. The French army, considered one of the finest in Europe, collapsed in 6 weeks. British forces evacuated from Dunkirk, abandoning their equipment, retreating across the Channel in defeat. Paris fell on June 14th. The armistice was signed on June 22nd, in the same railway car where Germany had capitulated in 1918. The symbolism was deliberate, a historical inversion that seemed to prove Hitler's central claim. The shame of Versailles had been erased. Germany was supreme. The soldiers who stood in Paris that summer, who marched past the Arc de Triomphe and posed for photographs beneath the Eiffel Tower, believed they were witnessing the end of the war. Britain would surely negotiate peace now that France had fallen. The Führer would consolidate his conquests, and Germany would dominate the continent as it was always meant to do. There was a sense of inevitability, a conviction that history itself was on their side. The recurring symbol of this confidence was the Iron Cross, that distinctive medal inherited from Prussian tradition, awarded for bravery and military achievement. To wear it was to embody the warrior spirit of Germany, to be part of an unbroken lineage stretching back centuries. The Iron Cross represented not merely individual courage but national destiny, the belief that German soldiers were heirs to a martial tradition superior to any other. But history is not a story written in advance. It is contingency, accident, the collision of choices and circumstances that no one can fully predict. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941 was the hinge upon which the war turned. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, committed over 3 million German soldiers to a campaign across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The objective was not merely military but ideological. The destruction of Bolshevism, the acquisition of Lebensraum, living space, for the German people, the subjugation of Slavic populations deemed inferior by Nazi racial theory. The German soldiers who crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, expected another swift victory. Intelligence estimates suggested that the Red Army, weakened by Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s, would collapse within weeks. The initial advances seemed to confirm this assessment. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. By October, German forces were within sight of Moscow. But the easy victory did not materialize. The distances were vast, the roads primitive, the Soviet resistance fierce despite catastrophic losses. And then came winter. The winter of 1941-42 was the coldest in decades. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. German soldiers, equipped for a short summer campaign, lacked adequate winter clothing. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was lethal. Frostbite claimed more casualties than combat. Weapons froze. Engines seized. Supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of snow-covered steppe, broke down. The soldiers huddled in inadequate shelters, burning furniture for warmth, wrapping themselves in blankets stripped from Russian civilians, and slowly began to understand that the war they thought they were fighting, a war of swift maneuver and decisive victory, had become something else entirely. One soldier, a corporal from Bavaria named Heinrich Böll, who would later become a Nobel Prize-winning author, wrote in his diary, "We were told that Russia would fall in 8 weeks. It has been 8 months, and we are still here, freezing, starving, dying. The cold does not care about ideology. The snow does not recognize the swastika. We are not conquerors. We are survivors, and many of us will not survive." The emotional contrast was stark. What they expected was triumph. What they experienced was endurance. The Iron Cross, once a symbol of martial glory, became a reminder of loss. Men wore it on uniforms that were patched and filthy, on bodies that were gaunt and exhausted. It no longer represented dominance, but desperation, the refusal to surrender even as the possibility of victory slipped away. The turning point came at Stalingrad. The battle, which began in August 1942 and ended in February 1943, was not the largest of the war, but it was the most symbolic. Hitler ordered the city taken, not for strategic reasons, but because it bore Stalin's name. The Wehrmacht, exhausted from a year of campaigning, hurled itself against Soviet defenders who fought for every building, every street, every room. The combat was intimate and savage. Soldiers killed each other with knives, shovels, sharpened entrenching tools. The city became a landscape of ruins, a necropolis where the living and the dead existed in proximity, so close that the distinction blurred. By November, the German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was encircled. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. The soldiers were ordered to hold their positions, to fight to the last man. Supplies dwindled. The Luftwaffe's airlift efforts, promised by Hermann Göring, delivered only a fraction of what was needed. Starvation set in. Horses were slaughtered for meat. When the horses were gone, men boiled leather belts and boots to extract any caloric value. The wounded lay in unheated cellars, their cries for morphine unanswered because medical supplies had run out weeks before. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the original force, fewer than 6,000 would survive Soviet captivity and return to Germany. The rest died, from combat, from cold, from disease, from starvation. For the German soldiers on other fronts, for the civilians listening to radio reports at home, Stalingrad was a revelation. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The propaganda machine tried to spin the defeat as a heroic last stand, but the truth seeped through. Germany could be beaten. The war was not won, and the price of continuing might be annihilation. The historical evidence for this shift in perception is abundant. Letters from German soldiers, intercepted by Allied intelligence or found on the bodies of the dead, reveal a growing despair. One letter, written by a sergeant in the 16th Panzer Division in January 1943, reads, "We were told we were fighting for the future of the fatherland. But what future can there be if we are all dead? The Russians keep coming. We kill them by the thousands, and still they come. Where are they getting so many men? Where are they getting so many tanks? We were told they were subhuman, incapable of sustained resistance. We were lied to. The lie was not merely about Soviet capabilities. It was about the fundamental nature of the war Germany had chosen to fight. The Nazi leadership believed that willpower, racial superiority, and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantage. But the Soviet Union, despite its losses, possessed resources that Germany could not match. Its population was larger. Its industrial base, relocated beyond the Ural Mountains during the 1941 retreat, churned out tanks, artillery, and aircraft at rates that dwarfed German production. And critically, the Soviet Union had allies. The United States, entering the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, supplied the Soviets with trucks, food, fuel, and raw materials through the Lend-Lease program. The combination of Soviet manpower and American industrial capacity created a force that Germany, isolated and overstretched, could not defeat. The transformation in German soldiers' perceptions was not instantaneous. It occurred in stages, through accumulated losses, through the realization that each victory was temporary and each defeat more difficult to reverse. After Stalingrad came Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, where Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front was repulsed with catastrophic losses. After Kursk came the long retreat, a fighting withdrawal across thousands of miles, through Ukraine, through Poland, back toward the borders of the Reich itself. In the West, the situation deteriorated with equal speed. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, opened a second front that Germany's depleted forces could not contain. The soldiers who fought on the beaches, in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the rubble of French towns, were no longer the confident warriors of 1940. Many were teenagers, conscripted in desperation as casualties mounted. Others were veterans, survivors of the Eastern Front, men who had seen too much death to believe in victory, but who fought on because surrender meant imprisonment or execution, because their families were in Germany and the Allies were bombing German cities into ruins, because there was nothing else to do. The bombing campaign transformed the German home front. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized London during the Blitz, was now powerless to stop British and American bombers that turned German cities into infernos. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin, each was subjected to raids that killed tens of thousands of civilians, destroyed centuries of cultural heritage, and left survivors shell-shocked and broken. The promise of Lebensraum, of a glorious empire stretching across Europe, had become a nightmare of ash and rubble. The Iron Cross, once awarded for heroism in distant lands, was now earned by firefighters pulling bodies from collapsed apartment buildings, by children digging through debris to find food, by anyone who survived another night of bombardment. By early 1945, the German military was a shadow. The Eastern Front had collapsed. Soviet forces were advancing on Berlin. In the West, American and British armies had crossed the Rhine and were driving into the heart of Germany. Fuel was scarce, ammunition scarcer, food almost non-existent. Soldiers deserted in increasing numbers. Those who remained fought with a fatalism born from the certainty of defeat. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how much more destruction would occur before the end came. Hitler, isolated in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, issued orders to armies that no longer existed, demanded counterattacks that could not be launched, and blamed everyone but himself for the catastrophe. He spoke of wonder weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, that would turn the tide, but these were fantasies. The industrial base needed to produce them in meaningful numbers had been destroyed by Allied bombing. The trained personnel needed to operate them were dead or captured. The Reich was bleeding out, and no amount of ideology could stanch the wound. The soldiers who fought the final battles, in the ruins of Berlin, in the forests of Bavaria, on the shores of the Baltic where refugees fled the advancing Red Army, knew the war was lost. Some fought because they feared Soviet revenge for the atrocities committed in the East. Others fought because the alternative was surrender to an enemy that might not offer mercy. A few still believed, clinging to the propaganda even as the evidence of defeat surrounded them. But most fought because they were trapped, because the machine of war, once set in motion, does not easily stop, because the momentum of violence carries men forward even when the destination is annihilation. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Reich that was promised to last 1,000 years had endured 12. The final accounting was staggering. Over 5 million German soldiers dead, another million missing, presumed dead. Millions more wounded or captured. German cities reduced to rubble. The economy destroyed. The nation divided. And the crimes committed in Germany's name. The Holocaust, the mass murder of 6 million Jews, the enslavement and murder of millions of Poles, Russians, and others deemed subhuman by Nazi ideology, had stained the nation with a guilt that would take generations to confront. For the survivors, the return to Germany was a journey into a landscape unrecognizable. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing the Soviet occupation zones. Women and children picked through ruins, searching for anything salvageable. The social order had collapsed. The currency was worthless. Food was obtained through barter or theft. The Iron Cross, once a symbol of honor, became a liability. Men hid their medals, discarded their uniforms, tried to blend into the mass of displaced persons hoping to avoid retribution or imprisonment. The epilogue of the German experience in the Second World War is not one of redemption, but of reckoning. The Nuremberg trials, held from 1945 to 1946, brought the surviving Nazi leadership to account for crimes against humanity. The evidence presented, films from concentration camps, testimony from survivors, documents signed by the accused, left no room for denial. The world saw what had been done in Germany's name, and the verdict was unambiguous. The ideology that promised greatness had delivered genocide. But the trials could not answer the deeper question. How did this happen? How did a cultured nation, the land of Goethe and Beethoven, of scientific achievement and philosophical depth, descend into barbarism? The answer lies not in a single factor, but in a constellation of causes. The humiliation of Versailles, the economic devastation of the Great Depression, the appeal of a leader who promised simple solutions to complex problems, the willingness of ordinary people to believe lies if those lies flattered their prejudices, the failure of institutions to resist the erosion of democratic norms, the complicity of those who saw what was happening and chose silence over resistance. The German soldiers who fought the war were not, for the most part, ideological fanatics. Many were conscripts, ordinary men who would have preferred to live ordinary lives. But they were part of a system that demanded obedience, that punished dissent with death, that offered no exit once the path was chosen. They fought not because they loved war, but because they feared the consequences of refusing to fight. And in fighting, they became complicit in atrocities, whether they personally committed them or simply enabled them by their participation in the machinery of conquest. The recurring symbol of the Iron Cross, which began as a representation of martial pride, ends as a marker of tragedy. The men who wore it believed they were serving their country, fulfilling their duty, earning honor through sacrifice. But the cause they served was poisoned at its root, and the honor they sought was illusory. The Iron Cross cannot redeem what was done. It can only remind us that courage in service of an evil cause is not virtue but complicity, that bravery without moral clarity is just violence with a decoration. The larger truth that emerges from the German experience of the Second World War is this: ideology, no matter how passionately believed, cannot alter reality. The Nazi leadership believed that racial superiority, willpower, and military skill could overcome material disadvantage, could forge an empire from conquest, could bend history to their will. They were wrong. The Soviets, whom they dismissed as subhuman, outfought them. The Americans, whom they believed were too soft and divided to sustain a war effort, outproduced them. The British, standing alone in 1940, outlasted them. The ideology that promised a 1,000-year Reich delivered 12 years of destruction and a legacy of shame. This is not to say that ideology is irrelevant. It matters profoundly, but its power is not unlimited. It cannot manufacture resources that do not exist. It cannot win battles that logistics make impossible. It cannot sustain a state built on lies and violence once those lies are exposed and the violence turns inward. The German soldiers who froze at Stalingrad, who starved in encircled pockets, who died in the ruins of Berlin, learned this truth at the cost of their lives. They were told they were fighting for a great cause, and they believed it, until the evidence became overwhelming that they were fighting for a lie. The epilogue is not one of triumph, but of warning. The Second World War, seen through German eyes, is a chronicle of how a nation can be led into catastrophe by leaders who promise greatness but deliver ruin, how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when they surrender their moral judgment to authority, how the intoxication of early victories can blind a nation to the abyss toward which it is marching. The soldiers who fought for Germany were not monsters, most of them. They were men, flawed and human, who made choices, some forced upon them, others freely chosen, that led to the deaths of millions and the destruction of their own country. The Iron Cross, that symbol which began the war as a mark of pride, ends it as a relic, tarnished and heavy with the weight of what it represents. It sits in museums now, behind glass, a reminder of a war that should never have been fought, a cause that should never have been embraced, a future that was promised but never existed. And for those who look upon it, the question remains: what makes a person willing to die for a lie? What makes a nation willing to destroy itself in pursuit of an illusion? The answer is not simple. It involves propaganda, fear, hope, desperation, the human need for meaning and purpose, the seductive appeal of certainty in an uncertain world. But the consequences are clear. The road Germany traveled from the triumph of 1940 to the ruins of 1945 is a road paved with choices, and those choices led not to glory but to devastation. The soldiers who marched into Poland in September 1939, confident and young, believing in their cause, could not see where that road would end. By the time they understood, it was too late. The machine was in motion, and it would not stop until it had consumed them, their families, their nation, and their future. May 8, 1945. Berlin lies in ruins. The war is over. The survivors emerge from cellars and bunkers into a landscape of ash and silence. The Iron Cross, if they still possess it, is hidden away, a reminder of a time when they believed in something that proved to be hollow. The promise of a 1,000-year Reich has become a 12-year nightmare. And the lesson, written in blood and rubble across the face of Europe, is stark and unforgiving. Ideology without humanity is not strength but madness, and nations that follow madmen into war will reap not glory but annihilation.